And again, for those of you who are new to Board Chat, we hold these monthly. And this one in particular is super casual. We have just incredible slate of local Minnesota experts joining us today. So we're going to whip through the content pretty quickly. But the whole idea is just to give you a quick update on kind of the trends that are coming down our path here that we need to be mindful of as charter school leaders. Our panelists today, we have Michelle Kaffa from Ed Allies. She's the policy manager there. They do a lot of work in the legislature, as most of you know. Carl Allen, COO and president of Formative Technologies. We also have Michelle Hoffman, principal, mainly on the audit side. She's going to share some great information about the PPP. We have Jim Martin from Martin Law, and Emily Cooley, the executive director of Creatively Focused. Jennifer Loon, she's a former Minnesota legislator from Eden Prairie, who has just incredible experience around education policy, and we're happy to have her with us today. And Karen Klinsing, my colleague, who also is a former legislator and has great experience in a wide variety of issues across the spectrum. Start with a legislative update from Ed Allies, and then we're going to jump into different buckets from transportation to special ed from our Minnesota experts, and then we're going to end with a little Q&A.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Kaffa. The last time I was here was early May, I think, and so that we were just getting ready to wrap up the first session or regular session. And it's August now, and we're on to our third special session. So I have a little bit has happened since then, and so I'll update you all on what got done during regular session, and then what's also been accomplished during the special sessions that have followed. So to begin, during regular session, there were a number. I'll backtrack a little bit. So we all know that COVID-19 hit in March of this year, and with that, the legislature took a hiatus for about a month, and when they resumed with a focus on COVID-19. And this also included education. So how do you respond to education in the time of COVID-19? And so from that, they introduced a number of education bills that were really to meet the needs of students, families, and educators during the time of COVID-19. And one of those bills that they introduced was HF 4415, which we called the COVID-19 Education Response Bill. And then they also introduced two other bills, which was the Education Policy Omnibus Bill, which was a carryover from regular session or before the hiatus began, and then also an Internet Access Broadband Grants Bill. And I will go through a little bit about each of these bills. And so I'll start by talking a little bit about the COVID-19 Education Response Bill. So what this bill was really meant to address was when they introduced this bill, Democrats actually first introduced it with a focus around hourly workers. And through testimonials and just really us and other partners really talking to the legislature and other members about the importance of focusing on the needs of students at this time, they started to shift their perspective and really include things that that students needed at that time. So students and families were asking for access to technology. They were asking for better supports for students receiving special education services and for their English language learners. They were also asking for food and nutrition and mental health support. So as I mentioned, after much advocacy from parents and students, they finally shifted this bill and actually deleted all of the provisions that had to do with hourly workers within the bill. And what ended up passing in the bill was they addressed the digital divide by expanding the eligibility for the telecommunication aid, and that helped to improve internet access and access to technology for our students. They also waived unrealistic requirements for students during the 2019-2020 school year. For example, the commissioner waived the requirement for assessments. And it's important to note that we still need assessments. We still need the data for our students so that we can know how this time has affected our students. But I think it's understandably so that was unable to occur during during this past spring. So we're definitely going to be advocating for the resuming of assessments so that we can really have an understanding about what the impact of the last 6 months have had on our students. But to go on, this bill also included provisions that would that allowed the Commission of Education to comply with the governor's guidance on CARES Act funding. And then one of the most important provisions in this bill was it allowed for licensure renewals for teachers during this time. So this was important because nearly 17,000 teachers, active teachers, were going, which is about 25% of the workforce, were at risk of losing their licensure by June 30th. And so the bill actually would expand it, or it extended that deadline, the June 30th deadline, so that teachers could not have their licenses taken away during COVID, when they should be worried about how do I, teach my students, and not about licensure. And so this is a great provision that was passed. This is actually the only bill that was passed during the regular session that responded to COVID-19 and students. And then during the special session, they came in really wanted to finish up business from regular session. So with that being said, the education omnibus bill was left on the table from regular session, and so they ended up finishing up business with that. And one of the most important provisions in that bill for our team was the language around dismissals. So this bill actually, what it did was it included an important provision that ended preschool suspensions for our 3 and 4 year olds, and then only allowed for expulsions under rare circumstances for our students. And so this was a really big win that our team has been working on, along with the Solutions Not Suspensions Coalition, for a number of years. And so that was wrapped up during the first special session. Coming into the first special session, there was also a focus on criminal justice reform, of course, a bonding bill. Those two things have remained a priority at the legislature, and then also continuing to respond to COVID-19. And as I mentioned, loose ends from regular session. But we also had a second special session in July. And with that, the legislature really was focused, as I mentioned, on criminal justice reform, a bonding bill, and then COVID-19 emergency responses. So we're seeing that as a continued trend, and we don't see that ending unless a bonding bill is passed. There's still continued debates around criminal justice. But as of now, what the education advocates are thinking is we're starting to have conversations with legislatures about how to respond to racial justice and education, and really merging those two issues together. I don't think they should be separated, because we have some of the greatest disparities within the state of Minnesota, or within this country. And so it's important that we're continuing those conversations right now, but we don't expect that there will be any, I guess, remarkable education proposals coming up in any subsequent special sessions, whether that is August or any ones that follow suit. And just, I guess, a little bit of context is that they will keep calling special sessions until the governor no longer needs his emergency powers. And so, and when they do call a special session, the legislature has a discretion to continue it as long as they would like. So
the only thing I would add is that it's unlikely that there'll be anything significant coming from additional special sessions. And right now, the governor's been calling them back every month as his emergency powers are set to expire. He can automatically extend them, but only if the legislature is called into session. So again, as we come up onto an election, I just think it's less and less likely that there'll be a lot of cooperation, that things will get passed. I'd also note that, some of the issues that are really a bright light is being shined on are issues that have been worked on and talked about in the legislature for quite a while, in terms of internet, connection and access to online, especially for remote and rural areas, but also for more urban areas. Maybe economically disadvantaged households not having that internet connectability or the devices that have been required for going to virtual learning models or online school. So we did some things like putting hotspots on buses in rural areas a few years ago with some monies, but the issue wasn't really resolved. And again, it just continues to grow as a problem while we are asking our schools to do different models from the traditional in-classroom learning and look to do that for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen a lot of data about, but I'm just curious if anyone knows. I heard at one point about 17% of students in the metro area, not greater Minnesota, but metro, were still without internet connectivity.
So I know that was the statistic when COVID-19 hit. And I don't know how that has changed. I think, I'm not sure how that has changed since March. However, it's also becoming more of a problem that students have internet, but they don't have strong internet, or they don't have the adequate internet to continue their learning. And so that's also a problem. So what I think we're really advocating for at the legislature is just reliable internet services, and not just any type of internet for students.
As we try to discuss the disparities and address them, I'm concerned that we won't be collecting data on attendance or achievement. Has there been any conversation about how to keep enough or sufficient data collection going during these times so that we can continue to keep a spotlight on the disparities?
I don't know if I can answer that at the moment, Karen, and that's something that I can either connect with you on or follow up with the group on. But from my understanding, there is, when we talked to the commissioner, she said school or districts are going to be either administering their own type of assessment, but it's not a requirement to address learning loss or to understand learning loss. But I think that right now the state is not mandating any type of assessment or anything to receive data on student performance, if that's what you're referring to.
Well, but I'm also talking about just even the issue, the data we just asked about with respect to access to the learning and also attendance. Because there are some urban areas, not all necessarily Minneapolis, St. Paul, that were experiencing 40% drops in attendance. And so it's great if districts have their own way of collecting it, but as a state, are we, is the legislature talking about the access to learning in terms of attendance, I guess?
Not that I've heard. And that's definitely unfortunate, but not that I've heard. And I think during the special sessions, not much of that has come up. They've been doing a number of informational hearings. There's actually one tomorrow in the Senate, but nothing is necessarily being done to pass legislation. It's just to get a better understanding of where we're at and what the concerns are.
Because I know as all the schools are having to determine what kind of model they're going to be rolling out when the fall term starts, according to the percentage of positive COVID rates in their county and all that complicated guidance issued by the governor. At the very least, I think if the schools would be required to, either communicate some of that data to the commissioner to help inform instructions at the legislature or by elected officials or the governor, could be helpful, because the schools are making they are doing those assessments. They're looking at which groups of learners sort of have not fared as well under the distance learning compared to others.
Yeah, that's pretty important. So thanks for that response. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to introduce Carl Allen from Formative. And Carl, so great to have you with us again today.
We launched a couple of years ago here in the Twin Cities. I'm based here. We manage transportation services for schools and districts and networks, including subcontracting services, managing routing and customer service and billing and back office for them. I'm formerly Director of Transportation for the Boston Public Schools before moving here. But my job, I'm from the Twin Cities, but was the Chief Operating and Financial Officer for the Harvest Network of Schools for a time upon moving back to the Twin Cities. Today, I just wanted to talk briefly about some of these things that we've been doing and some ideas around transportation that have emerged, things that we're seeing in Minnesota and elsewhere around, adapting transportation systems, contractor relationships, for the COVID environment, and also thinking beyond, as I'd said. So one is this idea, the first is kind of shifting the network design. Of course, people are talking about, A/B schedules and other ways of accommodating social distancing and so on. But one of the levers and mechanisms that we can use to shorten routes, which is another important thing that we're needing to do because of allowing for time for cleaning, and also just to minimize exposure time on vehicles, or potentially to accommodate looping or to accommodate more tight stacking of routes where schools may need to adjust schedules in order to maximize utilization of a specific vehicle. But one way to do that is to kind of shift to a more community stop or hub style network design. Another reason that this is happening, I'll say, is that, where schools are dealing with financial uncertainty, they're wanting to cut vehicles and transportation expenditure rather than just, they weren't going to be able to, no one was going to be able to double the number of buses as their capacity, allowance is cut in half. No one is going to be able to do that. People are rather, schools are concerned about finding more money for these other new demands and requirements of COVID and trying to take money out of transportation if they can. So the idea of a hub model where you can cover a broader geography, but lessen the time per route and shorten the number of stops, cut the number of stops, I should say. But what you're asking from families is to walk a little bit further to a bus stop. So you're kind of attenuating service levels in exchange for more direct routes, the ability to cover a broader geography, because you may have families that have opted out, families that are, going to elect for distance learning, families that want to drive their own students. And therefore what you're left with is probably still going to be representative of your assignment zone, your whole geography, but is actually more sprawling. And so really hard to design bus routes that actually go and hit all those students. And you end up with this need for kind of a community stop model. One thing about this that I'm excited about is this idea that we could start to recalibrate expectations, reset what it means for schools and districts to what are the mobility supports that families expect to receive from schools and districts. And if you can kind of recalibrate those expectations around, what it means to receive transportation services, we actually might be able to lock in a lower transportation budget, a lower, vehicle requirement in our transportation networks. And that's something that I'm really passionate about and think is kind of a follow-on from this need in the near term to use this to move to a community stop model. With respect to COVID preparedness, right? Everybody has done so much to prepare from a theoretical standpoint of what their buildings are going to look like, what dismissal is going to look like, what the capacity on their vehicles are going to look like. But the idea of scenario planning for the eventualities of a student that screens for symptoms or of an outbreak that occurs and how that touches transportation, I think is a really important topic that you can't really prepare or kind of drill enough for. I happen to, my wife was a CDC Epidemic Intelligence Service Fellow and deployed to West Africa during Ebola. She's been helping me. She works with Ramsey and Hennepin County on their homeless response in the Twin Cities. And so she's been, since March actually, dealing with outbreaks, dealing with screening processes, dealing with contact tracing. And the fact that as such an expert, she has to still, you can have a framework, you can have a guide, like the CDC guidance, which is not trivial to understand and to operationalize, but then to operationalize it in the context of a real situation, there's so much subjectivity involved. And so schools developing frameworks, again, this speaks beyond transportation, but schools developing frameworks to decision frameworks and to understand where decisions need to be made, who has the agency to make those decisions, and kind of what are the different approaches, deciding ahead of time, like what's a more conservative approach versus what's a more practicable approach, and who's going to be in the position to make those subjective risk assessments in each individual contextual moment is so important. And so you just can't drill that enough. One of the things we've been doing is just talking about these scenarios. What do you do when you're screening students as they're entering the building, they're getting off the bus and someone screens for symptoms? Well, you need to empower a bus aide or a bus driver not to be able to make a public health decision for the school, but to make, for instance, a risk assessment of the public health environment, the risk environment of their vehicle. So that they can say, well, this student was sitting here, according to the seating chart, but all the students were wearing masks, the windows were down, everybody was compartmentalized, everything was orderly. And so my assessment is that, it's, even though this student is symptomatic, it's not, the rest of the students on the bus were not at risk, or it wouldn't constitute. These are the things that you would need to understand in order to know what would constitute a meaningful exposure, right? The definition strictly is, 15 minutes or more within 6 feet of somebody. But when you're in a school bus with masks on and windows open and the compartmentalization of students sitting behind seats, even that student that's sitting directly in front of them, that may not be a significant exposure. It's actually a pretty low risk environment if all those conditions hold true. But those are big assumptions with respect to the student behavior and what's actually happening on that bus, that you need to have people that you trust, like bus drivers, being able to make those risk assessments for you. And then what will you do if they say, well, actually students weren't sitting in their seats, they weren't wearing masks, or they had their windows up, and so on. And then how do you handle that situation versus the former case? So there's a lot there, obviously, too. With respect to vendors in the current environment, this might be most apropos topic to the broad discussion that we're having today. There was discussion about the House bill that addressed hourly employees, that also addressed employees of contractors. So this is what a lot of contractors were kind of leaning on and hoping there was going to be more guidance, specific guidance from the state around payments for contractors during the closure last year. That doesn't seem to have been resolved, and sort of where things have landed for last spring is that a lot of schools have not paid certain contractors. There appears to be more consensus, and there was more clear guidance with respect to special ed and McKinney-Vento, or homeless and highly mobile contractors, and that many of those have been compensated. But on the gen ed front, a lot of contractors were not paid. And so the dynamic this fall is a few things, one of which is for new contracts, right? The guidance with respect to gen ed contractors for schools was that they should abide by their contract, right? And so contractors are making sure now that their contracts stipulate that there should be some compensation in the event of a COVID-related closure. And so there's kind of leveling around what fair rates are, so that there's fuel expenses and there's some other variable expenses that the contractor can turn on and off, right? But then there are, of course, other kinds of expenses that are fixed or sort of semi-fixed, like insurance, that it's really hard for them to turn off. And so what really important, I think, what I'll say to schools is, this, as opposed to last year when you're looking at closing out a year, if you're talking about an intermittent closure period where you have the prospect, hopefully the likely prospect of reemerging, right, from a temporary closure, or a period where maybe we go into distance mode and then come back into hybrid mode and are going to need more services, you'll have a much stronger interest. Individual schools have a much stronger interest in making sure that you're supporting those same drivers, your same contractors, the same vehicles, so that you can ramp back up when service resumes. And so I think what I'm seeing is contractors now making a much stronger push, and we're working with our schools and contractors on that front. There's other more complex elements to this that are not, where there's different solutions emerging across the map. I have a school, for instance, that's going to 4 days a week. And so that's what their calendar is going to be. And they're saying, no matter what, they're going to do 4 days a week. And so that's contractors aren't used to that. They're struggling right now to hire drivers on the basis of uncertain work. And so I think, broadly speaking, with respect to potential of closures, with respect to these delayed starts, the uncertainty around the volume of service that's going to be needed in the beginning of the year, the reticence of schools to make these kinds of commitments, especially if you're not starting right away, but you might want to start more service in October, drivers may not wait around for that. And so, and neither may some of these contractors. They may not be able to, or they're making really difficult calculations about, how much insurance to start, how many vehicles to maintain, how many drivers to hire and retain in anticipation of uncertain work. And so, I see that with charters, especially, whose cash flow and financial picture is very uncertain, a real tightening of the belts and a reticence to kind of make some of these commitments. My suggestion is that what I've been working with schools on, and this goes part and parcel with this hub stop idea, the idea of creating locking in a network that covers your network, that sacrifices some service levels, but that can cover your network with a lower vehicle commitment, that you could kind of lower your fixed cost commitment and then have a better chance, if you need to ramp up a variable component later in the year. Easier to find a few extra vehicles than to sort of find a wholesale new set of vehicles and drivers for your whole system. So to think about hedging, it's almost an insurance policy on the supply that you're going to need a month from now, or a supply that you may need after a closure, to kind of to calibrate. And these are the types of things we help schools think through. What does that minimum capacity level look like? What, modeling that out, what if we were at 80% for some period of time, or what if there was some other compensatory rate for, say, planned distance learning days? And what would be the worst case scenario if I couldn't get any additional capacity down the road? What would my network look like? What could it look like? And thinking along those lines, also recognizing that during closure periods or hybrid periods, if you have capacity that's locked in, or that you've kind of put on retainer, let's say, you can use that capacity and use it for food deliveries, use it for special ed related services, where you might typically use vans. In some cases, you could actually use bigger vehicles, space out students more, use some of those vehicles that you've got on retainer for creatively during the closure periods. And then you're actually able to leverage special ed dollars, according to the statute, to compensate, rather than just using gen ed dollars to hold big buses on retainer, waiting for school to resume. So that's another, so this idea that you want to hedge on the ability to ramp up capacity later, this idea that you can actually find ways to use them to meet your adaptive and changing needs of your students and families and staff during closure or hybrid periods. And then this idea that you can use some of the funding sources more flexibly during those hybrid and distance periods to cover some of that retained capacity costs. And then, of course, from system design standpoint, design so as to reduce the fixed cost commitment that you have. And that then long-term, then you can, as I said, put yourself in a position with reset what it means to what your service network looks like, what your boundaries are, perhaps, what your family's expectations are around walk distances to stops, what your, the boundaries, when I say boundaries, I mean also outer eligibility boundaries and walk boundaries, such that you can lock in some of this lower fixed cost network commitment, these lower fixed cost network commitments and design features. And after COVID, emerge with a different sort of network and a significantly reduced transportation cost burden. So these are some of the things that we're working on. And
well, what I love about Carl is clearly he understands transportation. And I think as board members, it's really important to know the complexities of what that entails. But I think once in a while, it's really good to kind of open the hood and look in and understand what school leadership is going through and your director of ops to make this all work, especially in this scenario. So Michelle Hoffman on the CARES Act and PPP.
I am here, and I'm actually coming sort of, at least my background is sort of from the audit side. So I'm always looking at, funding sources, compliance, things like that. So that's kind of always on my radar. So I'm here to summarize a little bit about just the funding that's available to schools. And I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about it, but just to sort of summarize where we're at, there is some actually new developments and some funding. And also, as Beth mentioned, talk a little bit about PPP loans as well. So just to start out with, the CARES Act in general, we're up to $430 million in total funds that are being allocated out to Minnesota charter schools and districts. And these are kind of in three big buckets that I'll summarize here. The first one is our ESSER funds, and this is elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund. So this was the kind of largest pot that originally came out, and how this was allocated, and this is about $140 million total. How this is allocated is that schools who have a Title I allocation get 83% of that Title I allocation in these types of funds. So your ESSER funds that you are allocated are almost your Title I allocation. They're about 83% of that. So the state had already come out, you can find that on MDE's website that allocates out all these funds to schools and districts. And while certainly these are intended to be used for relieving some of those coronavirus related expenses, but overall there's I would say somewhat vague as far as how, maybe not vague is the right word, maybe broad is a better word, use of these funds. Certainly they're intended to alleviate some of these extra expenditures that schools and districts are incurring as a result of the spring activities, what happened there, and then also moving forward. And so really, to summarize, these funds are to be used for responding to certainly coronavirus, basically maintaining the continuity of operations and services. Even if that does look different and how you do it might be different, still maintaining that level and however you need to. And because you might have to modify some things in order to maintain that level, that's where these funds are supposed to come in and assist you. So that's how these funds are intended to be used. And it does mention that where possible, use these funds, certainly it doesn't have to be, but they do make a specific reference to utilizing them to serve sort of underserved students, recognizing that this is a good way to really reach those underserved students. The second sort of pot of money in the CARES Act is what I would say GEAR funds. They're the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. This is a little bit smaller, about $43 million. These funds were also allocated automatically, or at least the dollar amount was allocated automatically out to districts and schools. And there was a couple of main areas that these funds are to be used for. The first one it mentions is summer school, and talked a little bit about, we just talked about transportation, and it talked about potentially transportation is something you could use these funds for. Do you have extra costs because you have less kids on the buses now, or you have more buses in service? So using them for transportation, or when it comes to summer school, did you bring on additional staff to kind of bring the staff to student ratio down? Things like that are what these funds are used for. The other main item, which we also talked about, is these funds are really also to be used to assist in the technology efforts of schools and districts. So you could use these funds to really identify those students who don't have great internet access, and help create, hotspots is one thing they list. So creating a hotspot where you can reach some of those students and that they can access. Also, devices. Not every student maybe has or had access to a device where they could do remote or hybrid learning. And any sort of other technology, broadband, things like that are what these funds are to be used for. Sort of, especially going back in the spring when everyone was virtual, but even looking in the fall now where some districts are virtual or some are doing hybrid, is, that obviously comes with additional costs. And these funds are intended to be used for some of those costs and to help reach those students, especially the ones who maybe don't already have great access, as we talked about. So some of those issues with maybe internet, these funds are hopefully there to help alleviate a little bit of that and really try and reach those students. The third sort of bucket in the CARES Act is actually a recent one. There was in early August, actually, the state approved an additional really large $244 million in funds that's going to be going to schools and districts. This is on top of those first two buckets I mentioned. And those were allocated out a couple different ways. 60% of the funds were allocated out based on your ADM count in fiscal 18-19. And the other 40% was a combination of ADMs and the population of underserved students that the school or district might serve. So there's a couple of different ways that those funds were allocated out. The dollar amounts for those funds have also been just really recently, I think about a week ago, put out on MDE as far as the allocation that schools and districts should expect. So that's sort of a third pot of money. And to sort of summarize, kind of going back to these three pots we have, so we have our ESSER funds and our GEAR funds, and then we have this new just coronavirus relief funds. So the first two funds, the applications have been going on for a while. I'm sure some of you have already been applying, but the actual due date for the application is not till May of 2021. So you do have some time to finally get those in. So even though you have an allocation out there, you do still need to submit a formal application just to summarize to the state what you plan to use the funds for. So once you have an approved application, you can begin drawing down those funds. And that process started in July. If you already had an approved application, you could start drawing those as soon as July. If you do have an approved application by November 1st, you are able to go back to March 13th of 2020 to start using those funds to cover those expenses. So if you had, March, April, May, you would have a lot of expenditures you incurred as far as, remote learning, things like that. These two buckets of funds can be used going back to March and actually can all the way till September of 2022. So these funds are really, it's a larger pot, or it's a fairly decent sized pot, are supposed to be used kind of both in the past and looking forward as to how this is affecting districts. So when we're looking at this actual third pot now, these newly allocated funds, these actually can only be used between July 1 and December 30th of this year. So there's only a 6-month window now to use this new allocation of funds. Again, there's a relatively broad use for these. These are certainly, intended to meet those overall, overall needs that are coming up as a result of sort of modifications due to COVID. So those are the three funds that are being allocated out to schools sort of automatically. You do have to apply for them, as I mentioned, but they are there for you to utilize and to assist really in all these different costs that we're talking about today. The third and the last thing I did want to mention now is the PPP loans. And I know this won't apply to everyone, not necessarily everyone, sought out a PPP loan. But I know I was able to look at, there's actually published lists of the charter schools, the ones that are over 150,000, and then also the ones less than 150,000, at least by entity, if not by name, or by type of entity, I should say. And there was more charter schools in Minnesota than I actually realized that applied for the PPP loans. So if you haven't already, it's basically too late, I will say. We just had, round 2 of the PPP loans was just going on. So to summarize those, obviously that they're really intended to help with, unexpected costs, and payroll being the biggest one, trying to cover that payroll if there's any changes in sort of your revenue coming in, things like that. So essentially the maximum loan amount you could get was 2.5 months of your payroll costs, or average payroll costs that were, there were some calculations that went into that. And they did change it to say, now we're looking kind of forward to the loan forgiveness piece. And basically they said, if you spend at least 60% of the loan on payroll, you could essentially get it all forgiven. So the only pieces that would not be forgivable are anything in excess, any non-payroll costs in excess of 40%. So if you chose to split it 50% payroll, 50% non-payroll, you could use it on like utilities and mortgage interest, things like that. That 10% above the 40 is non-forgivable. So when you're looking forward, so we're just getting into the forgiveness process. I know schools are starting to have questions on that. I don't know of any that have formally submitted their, forgiveness application, as those just kind of started. But that's the overall simplified calculation to how the forgiveness will be applied. So if you spent most of it on payroll, you can certainly expect that you probably will get it forgiven. There's a couple other stipulations that, you had to essentially maintain, similar levels of FTEs. I'm sure people are pretty aware of that. You couldn't certainly lay off a bunch of people and then get all of it forgiven for your payroll costs. So those are kind of overall summaries of the PPP loans. We've been working with some schools on trying to start that forgiveness process. Like I said, it just kind of started a few weeks ago. The applications just came out. And early on, I know a lot of people were kind of sitting on it and still kind of waiting, and now just kind of getting into it, since even early on when they first put the application out, there was some indication that there was still some clarification. People had questions even on the application for forgiveness. And there was indications that more clarification would be coming, more possible changes to it. So I think a lot of people are just kind of waiting, and now maybe in the next couple of weeks, maybe starting to actually look at applying for that forgiveness. So it's been sort of a process. We didn't want to jump on it too early as far as loan forgiveness, because we knew that it was very early and the initial application had questions on it. So I know a lot of people probably haven't gotten to the forgiveness stage yet, but that process really has just begun a couple of weeks ago.
Julie's asking, can we use PPP funds to pay teachers for the volunteer planning work they did over the summer?
So my understanding is that any payroll costs, as long as it's within the kind of that period, the covered period as it's called, payroll costs, as long as you maintain certain level of FTEs, you do not decrease wages by any sort of significant amount, even if you retain your FTEs, that overall your payroll costs should be included. There is a cap that you can't pay, anyone who's receiving a salary in excess of $100,000, that excess is not included in payroll. So there is that caveat. But as long as the payroll costs are incurred within that 8-week period and paid within the following pay period, so if you have any that were incurred but don't get paid for another week or two, then that is kind of your window of payroll costs. And then just another couple quick things I will mention on those loans real quick. If anyone's, sort of from the accounting side of it, if you're wondering, well, is this loan going to show up on our financials at year end? What if we think we're going to have it forgiven? On your fund level statements, which really, at board meetings especially, is really kind of where you focus. It's going to show up as an other financing source, almost a revenue, and it'll only show up as a loan on your government-wide financials. And GASB, our accounting standards board, did come out and say, even if, like, let's say September, October, that you've gotten it forgiven, it's still going to be a loan payable on those government-wide statements in June. So if you see it there and you say, wait, but we got it forgiven, it's going to show up as basically being forgiven in fiscal 2021. So if you're kind of wondering, how does that work? If we get it forgiven, do we even have to show it basically on the last year's financials? you will have that loan payable in your financials somewhere at year end if you receive the funds by June 30th. It's kind of a pretty high level, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
So thank you again, Michelle. We are going to move along to Jim.
Sure. So the issues that I'm going to talk about, policy issues related to contact tracing, employment issues, that type of thing. One thing I'll say about a policy creation for contact tracing is I haven't had that come across my desk from any of my charter school clients. There's guidance in the Minnesota Department of Health return to school guidelines, and even those don't say anything about schools being responsible for engaging in contact tracing. They provide tips for contact tracing, primarily for transportation, like what Carl was referring to in terms of seating charts, so you can see who's sitting next to each other, so you can determine who might have given the infection to someone else, or who might be carrying, that type of thing. But creation of a policy for contact tracing within the schools is going to be pretty problematic, in that you're going to have a lot of data practices issues in terms of health information, in terms of just disclosure of identity of students who are sick, and same thing in terms of identity of staff who are sick. And so I would suggest, unless there's guidance from the Department of Health that says that schools are going to have to engage in contact tracing, I would go very, very slow before you decide that you're going to start taking on the role of the Minnesota Department of Health in terms of trying to figure out where this disease is going. In terms of adjustments to policies or personnel handbooks, one of the things that I have advised my clients and helped them with is not putting in the actual handbook, but as an addendum that's available to all of the employees, are all the guidelines under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, or as other people know it, the FFCRA, that provides guidelines for staff and administration to know when individuals will be eligible for sick leave under the FFCRA, when they'll be eligible for the expanded FMLA coverage, when their students' childcare or school is not providing any services. So that is certainly one thing that you're going to want to do, is have some type of policy or addendum to the handbook regarding the FFCRA. The other thing that I've been working on with my clients is just putting together information for them to understand what their obligations are in terms of returning to work. Education Minnesota has put together, to its credit, a very good decision tree or flow chart that helps administrators and staff understand the different circumstances, what might happen. Let's say if an individual reports that they have actually contracted the coronavirus or COVID-19, or that they have been in contact with someone who's sick, or they live with someone who's been sick, or they live with someone who has a condition that makes them more susceptible. This flow chart or decision tree then helps guide them through what their rights might be, both under the FFCRA, under the Family Medical Leave Act, under school policy, and that type of thing. So, those are some adjustments that schools should be considering in terms of coming back to work. Is what are the situations when an employee has to come back to work? What are the situations when an employer has to provide some level of accommodation for the individual, and the level of accommodation, both if the employee is sick or if the employee is living with someone who might have susceptibility to the virus. So those are the major policy provisions that I've been seeing. Again, I would always suggest that boards should always review all of their policies, FMLA, sick leave, personal leave, right to know, all those types of things, and just see if they continue to have applicability to the current situation. What I found in looking at many handbooks is that they apply to this situation just as they would any other. There are some specialties that should be addressed, as I've talked about, the FFCRA and policies about different scenarios that arise. But that's for the most part, that's what I've been seeing in terms of policy creation or policy amendment or revision.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Jim not only has a law degree, but a master's in HR, so he's just a great resource.
For Carl, what percentage of schools that you support have students split in an A-B model for hybrid geographically versus by grade or other factors?
So I've got an array. Actually, when you get down to it, all the schools that we're managing service for in Minnesota, everybody is doing some variant. Everyone's a little bit different across some dimension. I have one school that's doing a strict A-B week. I have another school that's doing 4 days a week and distance for middle school, but full 4 days a week for elementary. I have other schools another school that's doing a very thoughtful kind of pod. They've found some additional community facilities and they're doing pods for all students that want in-person learning. That's going to be very interesting. Without exception, and this includes other large districts that I'm working in Houston, Indianapolis. Without exception, everybody is surprised at, irrespective of the rate of their students that are electing for distance learning, a lot of students, even that need or are electing for in-person learning, are opting out of transportation altogether, which is very interesting. And obviously facility constraints are kind of the first constraint that dictate sort of schedule needs, but in terms of transportation constraints, it's been a lot easier to get that space on buses because a lot of families are eschewing transportation or see transportation as a risk and don't want to put their kids on buses. And so we're doing a lot of work around carpooling support and apps that schools can use to support families with carpooling and also to reduce traffic at schools. And we have done work around, leveraging more walking supports for families and things like that. But an array of models, everybody's kind of making it up as they go, doing what works for their facility, their context, their families, and it's different everywhere. So it's been very interesting.
All right, thank you, Carl. And I'm just going to close if there aren't any further questions. Again, please feel free to reach out to any of these individuals. Thank you again to all our guest speakers, all of you. We just so appreciate your time. Most of all, thank you all for serving Minnesota kids. We so appreciate all you do. Please reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.